Every year, my dad and his best friend Billy would take my sister, me, and all the other kids on what they termed a snipe hunt when we went camping in Wisconsin with other family friends. If you are acquainted with snipe hunts, you are aware that they are essentially pranks. It was merely a method for my dad and his friend to think of new and exciting ways to get all the kids worked up about something. Snipes don't really exist. They told us that snipes are extremely hostile, avian-like animals that typically hide in trees and emerge only at night. Since we were little, we devoured this material. My sister and I used to become really thrilled every year, believing that we might finally get to witness a snipe. It was the same this year. On the second day of our trip, my dad and Billy headed off on their mission after all the families had settled in. They swore they heard one last night outside the RV, and they told all the kids that they were going to attempt and catch a snipe tonight. They said we could come if anyone wanted to. All the kids were obviously quite eager and a little scared right now, but my sister and I were prepared. All day, we were excited and full of anticipation. When the sun finally began to set, my dad gathered the children together. A few children had sticks in their hands for defense or combat, and one child even carried a wooden sword. As we all started to move into the woods, my dad mentioned that Billy had run ahead to scout out the location. After strolling for 10 minutes, we hear the sound of rustling in the trees. As we all glance up, Billy leaps out, covered in blood and shouting that he was hit by a sniper. The children all began to yell and flee, and as I was only 8 years old and didn't realize it was a joke, I also began to run. I ran through the woods, not knowing which way to go, until I came to a tree with a large shrub within that I could hide in. I recall doing my best to contain my tears and make no noise. After a few minutes of silence, I peered out from the bushes, and that's when I noticed it. Something that looked a little bit like a dog, but with very long and narrow legs. Its head was twisted and malformed, and all I could make out of its weird body were sparse fur patches. I had no idea what it could be. It passed slowly by, and even though I was quite a distance away, I could hear some faint moaning. To be honest, this stuff captivated me. Although I didn't want to look at it, I was powerless to turn away. The longer I looked at it, the more intense and peculiar was the feeling of dread I was experiencing. That's the only way I can sum it up, years later. I probably didn't really comprehend the meaning of those kinds of emotions because I was so young. I simply recall experiencing these kinds of daze or trances. Suddenly, I heard someone calling my name and the sound of leaves and twigs crunching in the distance. The object I was gazing at came to a halt and fixed its lifeless gaze on me. My father grabbed my arm and pulled me up, scolding me for running so far and said it was only a joke. He apologized and broke our shared gaze. Though I'm sure he was experiencing a wide range of emotions, I was only worried about this thing. I pivoted to see if it remained, but it had vanished. I heard nothing about it fleeing. I informed my dad what I saw and that I thought it might have been a snipe as we made our way back to the camp. He replied it couldn't have been, of course, and that was the year I discovered snipes weren't real. I'm not sure what I saw that evening, looking back. For years, I convinced myself that it was just a large coyote, but I couldn't figure out why I had a gut feeling it wasn't. My instinct told me that was what it was, but I didn't know that until I read about skinwalkers. I still don't have an explanation. Anything might have been the cause. Who knows? I was a pretty little child at the time. However, occasionally even now, during my bike rides or hikes in the woods, I get a glimpse of it observing me from the corner of my eye. For nearly 10 years, my wife and I resided in a cabin in the Canadian wilderness. We all loved the life we had there, in the quiet and tranquil forest. Our cabin was situated in a remote area with no roads even connecting it. Still, a few miles away from us resided a number of other families and cabins. We would frequently swap and get together for dinner, so over time, slender, faint trails developed between our cabins. We raised a variety of cattle on our tiny vegetable farm. For years, everything in our life was peaceful and pleasant, but then everything changed drastically. As usual, I was reading in our living room late one night when I heard the cattle begin to run around erratically outside. Since this was somewhat unusual for this late in the evening, I went to the window that overlooked our backyard and pulled the curtains. On the far left edge of the field, every cattle moved rapidly as though they were fleeing from something. I moved my eyes to the right, where I could see very little through the gloom, but after a moment I could see a large deer standing partly behind a tree that faced the house. It was staring directly at me, perfectly still and motionless. I felt really uneasy, but I couldn't tell if it was staring at me directly. Though I couldn't understand why the cattle would flee from a deer, I closed the curtain and resumed reading because there wasn't any risk. Before my wife wakes me up in the middle of the night, a few more weeks pass as usual. "What is happening?" She instructed me to shut up and pay attention. Her eyes were filled with fear, as if she had been up for some time. I heard something moving gently around the cabin very quietly. The sound traveled the entire circumference of the cabin, sounding like someone dragging a stick along the walls, and then it stopped. I got up right away, checked on my kids in their room, then took my hunting rifle and walked around to all of the windows. The last window I looked out of was my bedroom window, and that's when I noticed the same deer, standing motionless in the dark woodland, staring directly at me. Once more, I had never witnessed an animal behave in such a way, and I couldn't figure out what the noises around the cabin were. I shut the curtain since I had a gloomy mood. I had no idea what was going on, but I was starting to get nervous about it. Even though I didn't think in the paranormal or possessive, I had trouble understanding this. I made the decision to go for a lengthy walk the following morning to one of my neighbors' cottages to see if they had heard anything strange recently. I informed my wife to make sure everything was closed and to keep the kids inside the home before making my way down the path. I spent the first mile or so trying to think of any plausible explanation for what had been happening. However, the more I considered it, the more fearful I became. I had a strange feeling halfway to my neighbor's cabin, and nearly immediately after, I heard leaves rustling behind me. I turned back and saw the deer's eyes as it stood just in front of me, perhaps 15 to 20 feet down the path. I felt shivers down my spine as I stared into its eyes and saw that it had small pupils and a white iris, which set it apart from human eyes. I practically started crying as I hurried to my neighbor's cabin after turning around and seeing something that I couldn't even believe was real. Fortunately, when I got there, my neighbor was home and helped me settle in. He looked concerned about me, but not in the way I had anticipated. He didn't even appear shocked when I told him what I had witnessed. He started talking to me about his thoughts about the Navajo skinwalkers while we were sitting in his cabin. According to him, they would only appear if you had upset them or if they needed anything from you. But the fact that he was talking about it appeared to calm him down, which just made me feel more afraid. I quickly departed, and fortunately, nothing untoward occurred on the way back. I suffered from terrible paranoia and had trouble sleeping for the following 2 weeks, but eventually things started to get better. But the tranquil existence I had enjoyed at the cabin was stolen from me, and my terror of what I saw never really went away. We finally relocated closer to the town in order to provide a better life for our kids. Nearly 15 years have passed since the events, and I still haven't shared with my wife or children what I witnessed on the route or even what my neighbors told me. I'm not sure why exactly, but I feel compelled to keep them out of it for some reason. I believe that's the reason I've been holding it inside for far too long and felt the need to write it down and share it now. I was hiking in Arizona when this incident occurred back in 2015. After a brief section of desert, the trail ascended a medium-sized mountain and reached a passage that resembled a canyon at the summit. I used to decompress and escape the stress of daily life by going on 8 to 10-hour walks by myself. In any case, it didn't appear to be a well-known route because it was quite difficult to discover and there was no parking close by. It was obscured by a thicket of plants, and the trail was worn and faint. It wasn't like I was constantly bumping into people on high-traffic trails, so I wasn't too concerned about the path being unidentified. However, I never really looked for low-traffic trails. The trees grew increasingly parched as I descended, and eventually the majority of them appeared to be dead. Many had toppled over the trail, or had several heavy branches come off. There was no doubt that the route had not been maintained in a few years. As I descended lower, the trail started to pass through thick, overgrown brush. I continued walking because I could tell I was still on the trail because of how apparent the path was, but that's when I heard a really definite sound. There's a whistle blowing up the mountain. I heard the whistling hold a few notes before stopping, although it was quite weak. Admittedly, it was eerie and unsettling, but I assumed there was another person following up. That was the only thing that made sense at the time. After 20 more minutes, the same tuneful whistle appears to me once more, although this time it's considerably closer and louder. This time, I was a little more afraid, but I wasn't going to abandon the trail because of a guy whistling close by. I continued climbing for nearly a quarter of a mile, carrying my pocket knife in case something happened. I had to go around the river since a tree had fallen directly across the route and the prickly branches made it tough to get over. After taking a few feet and turning to the right, I saw a little valley that was probably once home to a river. But in the center was a little den constructed out of big sticks. Its sophistication convinced me that it was a creation of man. I began to put the whistles in the den together, thinking that maybe someone lived here. I decided I had to leave the valley immediately since I had a nasty feeling about the whole event, but as I was turning to go, I heard the same whistle coming from behind me. I turned to face the den fast and felt my heart halt in horror. I was shocked to see a goat standing directly behind the valley, where I had heard the whistle. It stood there unmoving, and I felt like its eyes were peering right into mine. Its size in comparison to other ones I'd seen in the neighborhood also caught my attention. At this moment, I was completely out of control and unable to process the entire incident. It took me a few seconds to gather my composure, and then I gently started to go back, still facing it. However, when I retreated one step, it opened its mouth in an odd and slight way before letting out the identical whistle that I had heard far too often. I ran down the mountain, falling over rocks and trees several times as my dread took control. As I reached the trail's end, I heard the whistle one last time, drifting quietly down the mountain. I had never shared this encounter with anyone because I felt that no one would ever believe me and that I would just come out as a coward. However, I was unaware of skinwalkers until lately, and upon further investigation, I came to the conclusion that this might be the sole explanation for what I observed.